So my robot is essentially where I want it from a design standpoint, and I could work on posing this in a more natural position, and I'll do that more in a workflow video because that's just a matter of just rotating and positioning all the different objects. What I want to talk about right now is I want to start talking about the environment and rendering. So I have my lighting pretty much set up the way that I want it, but I don't like the really dark background. And so I want to kind of get rid of that vacuum of space, or at the very least, add some kind of variation to the background. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. Right out of the box, the background is always black. Okay, and so what I can do is if I go into the same place where I get lights, I can introduce something like a background. And a background introduces an object that can receive a texture. It could be any kind of picture, and it's just a flat two-dimensional background that projects towards the camera. And so if I render that, now you can see that I have this kind of gray background. And if I were to apply, I'll just borrow one of these textures. I'll just drag and drop that red texture. Now when I render this, now I have a color in the background. So this is a really simple way to control the color. And by the way, this is not extending to the edges, mainly because of the render settings, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this background is a two-dimensional image that registers towards the render view. Okay, so no matter where I orbit this or rotate it, I'm always going to have basically a two-dimensional image that's projected towards the camera. That's a background. Now, alternatively, I'll just delete this background. Alternatively, we have an object called a sky object. And if I give that a render, I've basically achieved almost the exact same thing, and I could apply a texture to it. And when I render, I could see that that I've achieved that background color. Now, the difference between a sky is that you can interpret the sky as kind of a really enormous sphere that we're looking at from inside our model. And so anything that we apply to the sky object, we can actually turn and look in space. And so we could map an image to this. I didn't want to delete the sky. Let me undo that. I just want to delete the texture. So if we map an image to the sky, we can actually look around at the sky. And so to demonstrate that, I'm just going to dig into the content browser here, and I'm looking for presets, Cinema 4D, materials, and basic. And inside basic, I know that there's some kind of a sky in here. There it is, Sky 01. If I give that a double click, I now have that loaded inside my material manager here, and I'll just click, drag, and drop that onto my sky object. And now when I render, I'll actually see that sky object projecting inside my sky object. And so when I look around, you can see that that material is actually moving. So there are some advantages to sky and background, respectively. And the one thing you need to keep in mind with the sky is that under certain conditions, it actually has illumination attached to it. So when we do certain kinds of rendering effects, we actually get more light into the scene when we introduce a sky. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I have a sky and a background, and I'll just delete this sky texture because it kind of didn't really sit well with the aesthetic that I'm going to go for. So for now, I'm going to let the background color of the sky just default, and I want to focus a little bit more on the robot. Now, I understand how I can create some textures and apply that to my robot, and right out of the box, I'm getting a really decent quality render, but there are some things that I can do to change the aesthetic of my render just a bit. And what I can do is I can actually change the render settings, and so at this point, whenever I render something, I'm always either hitting Command R or I'm clicking on this icon, the leftmost render icon. The icon in the center we looked at when we were rendering the snowman, and for the most part, we're rendering view. Unless you choose to render region and click and drag a render here, whenever we click this button, we're rendering our view. Now to the right of that, there's one more render button, and that's render settings. And the render settings, you can This is the place where you establish the resolution of your final output. It's the place where you can determine all the properties of the image that you're capturing. So typically, if you design something in 3D and you want to render that out for print or render it out for the web, or you create an animation and you want to output it for video, typically what you need to do is you need to adjust the render settings to accommodate whatever the format is and the sequence is of your render. And the render settings by default, if you are arranged in tabs. And so if I look at the general tab, for the most part I can always ignore those, and I just want to let those render as a default full render. The output tab, this is where you can set your resolution of your rendered file. Okay, and so if I click on this output, there's some pre-configured choices that I can choose. Screen, web, film, and video, and maybe I'll just do this HD 720. And so if I look now, I got a 1280 by 720, so 1280 pixels wide by 720 pixels high. And you'll notice that even when I do that, it kind of, it might reconfigure my view, but at the end of the day, I'm still rendering. When I render to my viewport, I'm rendering whatever my screen resolution is, okay? But when you render for output, you need to determine what your target resolution is, and you do that through the output tab. Now the save tab becomes very important. So if I make a project and I want to save this file out, and for those of you using the demo, you only have this capability if you register the demo. Typically what I'll do is under the save tab, what we want to do, it'll say file, and we click on the ellipse and we determine the location of the file that we want to render out. And this is usually inside our project folder. And so in this case, I'm going to go find my robots project folder inside my class folder, inside robot. And typically what I do is I'll make a renders folder inside my project folder. Probably want to spell that right. I'll change that when I go back out to the Finder. But I have this renders folder. What I can do now is call this robot maybe still 01. Okay, so I'll give that a name. I'll hit save. I didn't actually save the file yet. I just saved the target location or the destination for that project or the render that I'm about to make. I can choose the format of my render here, so I can render to lots of different kinds of files, and maybe I'll render to a Photoshop document. I can choose the bit depth and a number of other things in here. So output determines the resolution of the file, and the save determines the path and the file type. Okay, and so once I do that, in order to generate a file, and let me just show you the destination folder here. If I go into robots, renders, there's no file here. If I go back to Cinema 4D, if I just rendered to my preview, I'm not saving this file. This is just a temporary render of whatever's inside my screen, so I can get an idea of what my design looks like. Once I set the render settings, okay, I've set these render settings, I can save this project file, it'll remember what these render settings are. Once I do that, if I want to output this file, the file with this resolution and this file type, what I need to do is I need to click on this center render button, and I need to render to picture viewer. This opens up essentially a separate little application that renders and tells you a lot about your file and kind of shows you the progress of it. And right now we can see that we're viewing a file at 55%. If I bump that up to 100%, this is the actual resolution of my file. And I've generated a Photoshop document. And in fact, I can look at the layers if I've included different kinds of layers, and I can apply filters to it. And now if I look inside my renders folder, I get this file called robot_still01 with some other numbers following it as a Photoshop document. So now if I go back into Cinema 4D, if I render to picture viewer again, I'm going to overwrite the existing file, and Cinema 4D kind of, warns me that I'm going to do that. I'll say yes. It re-renders and overwrites the existing file. If I say, well, I like that render and I want to save it, but I want a slightly different perspective on the render, I'll just change the composition of my render a little bit. I'll go into the file name and I'll change this. Instead of still01, I'll call it still02. I'll go to output and maybe I'll change the resolution. So instead of doing HD 720, I'll do HD 1080. So now I'm doing a 1080p render, or it has a width of 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels high. And now I can render to picture viewer. Because I've changed the file name and the resolution, I'm going to end up with a different file. Okay, so it's still rendering. I can see the progress bar here. Now it's done. And now when I go to the project file, I have a completely separate document. And if I double click on this, it should open up in Photoshop, because that's the target file type that I created. So that's the process of capturing individual renders and saving those out as separate files. So experiment with that process. Again, if you have the demo, you're going to have to register this to activate this functionality. And otherwise, if you own Cinema 4D or you're working on one of the campuses, you should be able to set those render settings, determine the project destination, and render through picture viewer. If you're using 10.5, the render settings does look a little bit different, but all the terminology is the same. It's just organized slightly different. There's tabs running across the top, and you should be able to get at that pretty quickly. If you get hung up in using version 10.5, post in the discussion forum, and I'll try to walk you through it. So here's a higher resolution render. That looks pretty good. So the next thing that I want to talk about is simply the aesthetic of the render settings, and we'll do that in the final presentation, and then we'll wind down the robot project. So we'll catch up in the next presentation.